Hello, this is John Grills from Creepy. Want to see something scary? Shudder is the ultimate streaming service for fans of horror, thrillers, and the supernatural. Brought to you by AMC Networks. Shudder is a premium streaming service that promises its members a multi-sensory dive into fantastical worlds. All uncut and commercial-free. Discover films and series that cover the entire horror spectrum, including highly anticipated new releases like The Boy Behind the Door, and one of my new favorite movies, Psycho Gorman. Available ad-free, on demand, and through the platforms you're already on. Shudder. So good, it's scary. Sign up at shudder.com. That's SHUDDER.
This is Salt and Spine.
Black people have contributed as laborers forever anonymously in this country, as enslaved, and doesn't get credited enough. I mean, not just in food history, in any history.
You cannot say that you are interested in American cooking, American cuisine, if you're not including Black foodways in that conversation.
Hi there, I'm Brian Hogan Stewart, and you're listening to Salt and Spine, Stories Behind Cookbooks. You just heard from today's two guests, Marcus Samuelsson and Osai Endelin. Marcus and Osai are two of the folks behind a new cookbook, The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. First, we have Chef Marcus Samuelsson, who has become a household culinary name, building his restaurant empire from Red Rooster in Harlem to now more than a dozen eateries around the globe. He's won multiple James Beard Awards and is a regular on Food TV, from winning both Top Chef Masters and Chopped All-Stars to hosting No Passport Required, his show with Vox Media's Eater. And of course, he's written several cookbooks and a New York Times best-selling memoir, Yes, Chef. For his latest book, The Rise, Marcus teamed up with James Beard-winning food writer Osai Endelin, whose wide-reaching work includes writings in The Washington Post, Time, and Food and Wine. She's also working on a forthcoming book focused on the systemic racism in American restaurants and dining culture. Now, in The Rise, Marcus and Osai bring together dozens of Black people from across the food industry, chefs, historians, activists, to help tell the story of Black cooks and the story of American cuisine. In these pages, we hear from folks like authors Michael Twitty, Jessica B. Harris, and Tony Tipton Martin, chefs like J.J. Johnson, Mashama Bailey, and the late Leah Chase, to activists, home cooks, farmers, publishers, and more. It's hard to summarize a work like this one that's so wide-ranging and yet also centers deeply personal stories. In short, it's a celebration of Black cooking, a rising class of new Black chefs and voices, and an effort to reclaim and recognize the contributions and talents of generations of Black cooks. I spoke with both Marcus and Osai separately about The Rise, and we've edited the interviews together here for a better flow, but please note that we're not all in conversation together on today's show. Also, this episode, Salt and Spine kitchen correspondent Sarah Varney took The Rise for a ride, making a big pot of crab curry with yams and mustard greens. That's later in this episode. And we've got two featured recipes from The Rise for you to make at home. So let's jump right in. First, I talked with Marcus Samuelsson about his upbringing, his early culinary career, and what led him to creating this new cookbook, The Rise. Hi, Marcus. Thanks so much for joining us on Salt and Spine.
Thank you so much for having me. This was one of the podcasts that I've been listening to, and very excited to be here. And when we mapped out The Rise, I'm like, it would be great to be on Salt and Spine. So, yeah.
That's awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. And yes, I'm thrilled to talk about your latest book, The Rise, which is beautiful. I've loved leafing through it recently and can't wait to cook from it. We always like to start with our guests by talking just a little bit more about you. I think many folks know your personal life story to some extent, but to give folks a taste of who you are before we talk more about the book specifically. So you were born in Ethiopia.
Yeah, no, I was born in the countryside of Ethiopia in a small village called Abragodana, which is at this moment we're speaking, Ethiopia is going through a lot, and my heart goes out to everything that's happening in Ethiopia, and it's just, you just want it to be peace, and it's just such a traumatic year already, 2020, so on top of that, to everything that's happening there, it's just really sad, and I hope it gets straightened out sooner the better. Born there, was adopted at a very young age My mom and my sister and I, we had tuberculosis, and she walked us into a hospital. Not only did she walk us to the capital, she walked us to a hospital, and she passed away. And then we survived TB, but we were just 3 and 5. My older sister Linda, and a nurse at the hospital was kind enough to take us in. She had 3 kids of her own, and then eventually we stayed with her until she set us up with an adopted family in Sweden.
Yeah. And so you moved to Sweden when you're 3 with your sister. And at that point, I think as you're a child growing up in Sweden, food becomes like a pretty big part of your life. I mean, even on a day-to-day basis of like fishing with I know you've written before about going fishing with your dad and catching lobster and crayfish and smoking the fish. And then, of course, your grandmother, I think, has perhaps the biggest culinary influence on you as a child. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generational also, but my grandparents and my uncles and so on, my father grew up on a tiny island on the West Coast where we get amazing seafood. It's very seasonal, but you know, every month or every other month, there's a shift of what seafood. They're basically, you either a fisher person or you make boats or you consumed with working in the trade of seafood and ocean.
Sure.
And on my mom's side, my grandparents, you know, they grew up very, very poor. So I think the layer of first imagine Sweden as a poor country, which could be hard today to imagine that then lends itself to natural craftsmanship, right? So my grandparents and my uncles, they made everything. They made maybe not shoes, but everything else was handmade, which meant that you went fishing 4 days a week and you had fish 6 days a week. And you know, so with that, for my grandmother, there was always a season of something. Like foraging was not something you talked about because then you gave up the best places, for example, the opposite of Instagram, right?
Right.
But it was always a season. When I say there was a season for something, you walk in, you run up the stairs up to her house. You open up the door. To the left is my grandfather screaming at the radio. Straight ahead is my grandmother. And in that kitchen, there is mushroom to be dried over there, lingonberry to be cleaned out. There's a stock going on in the back. Bread is in the oven. Watch out. So you learn this movement of food is such a core part of who they are. You know, so that's why I grew up. And at the same time, my parents, you know, in the 70s and the 80s were, you know, middle class households. So where everything wasn't made, you know what I mean? But the craftsmanship really comes from that other generation of my grandparents and my uncles.
Yeah. And what age did you start actively sort of cooking alongside your grandmother?
Since day one, since I was 5 years old. Yeah. I mean, and it's like if you know, my grandmother, I never remember playing with my grandmother or my grandfather. It was, you came to that house ready to cook or help out. And it could be running down stuff to the pantry or labeling stuff or jarring. You don't feel like it was work, but it was definitely not play. You know what I mean? Sure. Because you don't play around food. There's a knife, there's a hot oven. So for me, it was a very lovely, fun stuff, but you definitely were making stuff. If I wanted to play, I hung out with my friends, you know, and if we went over to grandma's house, some of my friends didn't want to go over to grandma's house because, you know, we wasn't just playing soccer and hanging from the trees. If you went in the trees, you went apple picking.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned soccer. I know you played soccer pretty passionately to the point of maybe, am I getting this right? You maybe even thought it could be a career path for you, or how did sort of you envision what your career path might be? And was there a moment where it sort of landed on food for you?
Yeah, I think my life has really been about a couple of things, right? Like soccer was definitely a big part of that. I'm still friends with those kids that I played with. We still see the coach every year. And I learned a lot about training and discipline and so on. And obviously food. And there's similarities between being in a kitchen and being with your friends and the kitchen has that us against them type of thing that I really love, that you kind of feel in a band or in a soccer team, you know, there's a camaraderie there. And I traveled early with soccer. So, you know, it's something I'm still very passionate about and enjoy, you know.
So you then go on to sort of, you go to culinary school, you start working your way through kitchens. We'll condense all of this a lot. I'd love to talk more about it, but of course you have a wonderful memoir folks can read too if they want to dig in a little deeper. we're going to come back now to the most recent book of yours, The Rise, which is subtitled Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. Can you talk a little bit about how the idea for The Rise came about? I think it, if I'm understanding correctly, sort of came to fruition really after the 2016 election.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very slow with my projects. Like each book takes about 3 to 4 years.
Uh-huh.
I think always about the books as a way. My father was a geologist, and he worked, and then he did books as well in the basement. And it was a way I grew up around him doing books. And I love working on books because you learn parallel with the project. You have something to say. There is a point of view, but you also evolve. Mediums next to you evolves. Podcast had basically in our field just started around 2016. And now it's a major part of how we articulate ourselves and learn, right? I did The Soul of a New Cuisine in 2007, right? It's really the starting point for me about understanding the links between Africa and America. And I was always been inspired by Edna Lewis and Jessica Harris and Tony Tipton Martin. And that book, I was very young in terms of understanding West African food and South African food. I've gone to South Africa a bunch of times. And I just felt like I always wanted to do a book that was very current in this moment here. And so I started to craft on The Rise around 16, and had the amazing opportunity to work with Usai and Yawande and the team. And the book doesn't really come to fruition until we really start meeting the chefs. When you have Usai comes back from spoken to these incredible chefs, then now the book goes in a different direction, which I love, and that's really the back and forth. I never really collaborated. This was a very unique way of collaborating for me, working with Usai, which was amazing. And I knew I wanted to go in a different direction. When I worked with Veronica Chambers on Yes Chef, it was a singular focus on my journey, but I knew Veronica knew how to tell that story because I've known Veronica for forever.
Sure.
And I love also the people that Usai brought into the book that was not, I didn't want the book to be just the chefs that I worked at Red Rooster. That wasn't enough to tell this story, right? As much as I love those guys, some of them are in there, but in order for this to be a broader book, listening to the stories of Tavel in Austin, or Greg in Portland, or Aisha in Los Angeles, or Mashama and Savannah, like it was important to tell multi-layered Black stories that are super delicious, super complex, and we have to unpack it.
Telling these stories in part fell to Osai Endelin, who co-authored The Rise, conducting interviews and creating profiles of the folks featured in this book. I talked with Osai about her role in the project and how she brought together all of these voices from across the industry.
Hi, Osai. How are you?
Hello. I'm like a lot of people, I'm here.
Yes, you're here, and we're grateful that you're here because we're here right now in this moment to talk about The Rise, the new cookbook by Marcus Samuelsson that you co-authored, subtitle is Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. And I'm really excited to talk to both you and Marcus about this book. And I want to start just by talking a little bit about how, from your perspective, the book came together. Like, what was your involvement in putting this together? And what role did you sort of play generally for folks to understand the contributions you made?
Sure. Well, every cookbook collaboration, and I would say probably every book collaboration has, a unique story. This project already had legs before I came on board. And like with a lot of book ideas, it morphed as time went on and it became more clear what we were trying to do. My initial task was to bring essays into the book that could help articulate a very broad and, very contemporary look at the influence and the reach of African American and African diaspora cooking in the United States. But what that started to become as the project, proceeded was, I tried to be a thoughtful, I mean, I don't know the term, maybe antagonist in a way, to sort of kind of question and poke holes in premises and ideas that, were suggested or presented to me. One of the challenges that I felt like I had was there wasn't a huge existing model for a book like what I was being asked to help produce, right? We hadn't really seen this kind of conversation happen in modern day publishing that was representative of, a personality and celebrity figure like Marcus, with the increasing conversations and awareness around Black people in the many areas of food in which we exist, and an ability to deal openly with the very complex and difficult history that frames a lot of this food and food culture's presence, in this part of the world, period. That's a lot to take on in one book. And it's not one that I feel like was ever me to own fully in this project. But I do think that what I tried to do was bring forth a lot of integrity to the stories that I was able to help tell, and to convey a sense of deference and respect for people who are doing this work right now that may not have the kind of visibility that we're accustomed to certain figures having, and people whose stories are, much older, but who are just as integral to the conversation that we are having right now. So, I was kind of like an ideas person. I probably was considered kind of like a negative Nancy at times. But, that's the responsibility that I feel like you have. And, I won a lot of battles. I didn't win others. And that's what it means to collaborate, right? Like, you stir everybody's stuff in one place, and, you really hope for the best. I can say that I'm satisfied with what I was able to contribute to this project. And I think, projects like this are better for, and, Marcus will probably be the first one to tell you, like, for that constant pushing back and saying, well, what about this? And a consideration in that vein is, taking on so many different cultures and so many different histories. I'm a California-born Black person of partial Nigerian descent. Well, actually, my mother, at her ancestry, appears that, her ancestors are from that region as well. But, her parents came from the American South. That's a very different point of view than someone like, Marcus, who, his story is well known. And, but we still experience Blackness in certain ways. Some of those ways overlap. And how does that translate in a food story that encompasses a lot of cultures and, unique narratives that don't belong to either of us? So I really tried to root the book in the experiences of the people we profiled. And, that was the jumping off point for the recipes that you see, all of which, of course, have, Marcus's personal kind of expression influenced in them.
Yeah, and I think it's a particular challenge as you work on a project like this, right? Because we look at the cookbook publishing industry over time, and it has not been representative of the contributions that Black cooks have made. So you're struggling to sort of, I would imagine, I don't want to put words to your mouth here, but I think that you have this challenge of trying to tell this broad story, while, as you noted, also being true to so many various identities and culinary identities that folks are bringing. How do you sort of balance all of that as you're thinking about writing these essays and talking to these chefs and authors and folks who you featured? And what sort of things did you learn as part? Did you learn things? I imagine you did, as you were putting together all of these profiles of folks.
I certainly learned a lot. One of the things that I realized right off the bat was, no matter how experienced these people were in their respective careers, whether they be activists, authors, professors, chefs, caterers, there was a little bit of a sense, and this could have been impacted by just the time of day or the day of the week that, we had these interviews. But like, I got this sense initially, like, this sort almost like a sense of like, oh, just we ate whatever, or like my mom cooked this or whatever. Like there was just sort of a casualness around describing people's own food stories. Now, these are folks who are all very intensely committed to talking about like ancestral foodways and representing maybe people that they interview or that they put on their social media platforms with great care. But when it came to kind of, focusing on them, the story somehow became very small. And it seemed to me a recurring theme when I would go back over these transcripts to kind of go back and tease out and say like, well, yeah, but I want to hear about that casual whatever dinner from Tuesday night, right? I want to know what you grew up eating. I want to know who cooked in your family. Where did you grocery shop? Did you have a garden? One of the people who was most actually vivid, that wasn't universal, but it was common. I would say one of the people who was most vivid, and this won't surprise anyone who's heard her speak, is Davida Davison, who is the executive director of Food Lab Detroit. And her family comes from Alabama, where, from Selma, where they have just had, her ability to convey. I mean, there was a moment where she kind of broke down what her mother's food schedule was like, and it was like Mondays, it was this, Tuesdays, it was this, Wednesdays, we remixed this to do that. Thursdays, this was my job. Fridays, this is my brother's job. I mean, I'm totally truncating it right now, but there was this just vitality in her recalling how much care her mother made to ensure that there was, these meals on the table, that they were whole meals, they were nutritious and fortifying, and they were deeply rooted in traditions that they had brought with them from, migrating north. And, there were times where, I kind of felt like I was having to like pull it out, like, tell me what you ate,
Yeah.
And I think but here's what would happen that was so cool. Like as the conversation would go on, and I would sometimes reference another conversation I'd had, or, sometimes what happens when you're interviewing someone, and I'm sure you've experienced this, people start to say, oh, like I get what we're talking about now, right? Like they kind of lock in and you can almost hear the energy shift, right? And they're like suddenly deeply engaged, or they have a memory. Sometimes it's because they haven't thought about this stuff in a long time. And so, I mean, this book, has come to kind of mean a lot of things to different people. But for me, I kind of find myself thinking back to those early conversations, late 2017, early 2018, talking to people whose work I've admired, whose work I've studied. I sat down for 2 hours in an empty Dookie Chase's restaurant one afternoon with the queen herself, Mrs. Leah Chase. And she spoke very generously about her experiences growing up in Louisiana between Madisonville and New Orleans, and, her start at the restaurant, navigating different aspects of her career. Of course, she was, her comedic timing was perfect as ever. I mean, like that time is something that I will treasure, right? And so I think you asked me, how do you balance it? I mean, I think your job as a writer when you're doing a profile like such that we see here is try to be clear about the, what this person's work represents. And that's really hard to do in just a few hundred words, like, right? Like each one of these people, some of them have their own memoirs. Many of them, should be working on them. That's a note to some of you. But like, how do you encapsulate, Fred Opie in just one spread? That's what we call, layout in books. How do you summarize Tony Tipton Martin? How do you put what BJ Dennis does, which is so visceral and so physical and so emotional, onto a page, right? Where you can't touch or smell or hear his voice, right? And so I tried not to get too caught up in like what I couldn't do, and just tried to really focus on, honoring, if I was this person, how would I want this story to be presented? And, I recently saw one of my, mentors, Bill Addison, described my essays in this book as unflinching. And, I was so appreciative of that, because there's a lot of struggle in this narrative, but there is a lot of beauty and triumph and perseverance and pride And I really wanted all of those things to come through. Sometimes it's very easy for people to, especially folks who are sort of outside the narrative of African American history, to really focus on some of the darker stuff. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to it, but that's not all there is. And so to be able to hold these truths at the same time is a real exercise, I think, in how we tell stories about ourselves as Black people, but also how we invite folks who may not identify with our individual narratives to be a part of this conversation as well. And that's really what I wanted, is for someone who doesn't, for anyone, who's reading this book, to be able to place themselves into this narrative and understand that while this is a very broad history, it is also kind of at the same time specific, but in its specificity, it becomes universal, right? Which is a thing that they teach writers a lot when it comes to like personal essays, right? The more specific and the more narrow you get, the more wide reaching the spirit of the piece becomes. And so just that constant juggling, I don't know that it was, was it successful like cover to cover? I mean, that's for readers to decide, but I know what I put into it, and I did my best.
I talked with Marcus, too, about the structure of the book and bringing together so many voices for a volume like this.
You talk about how the book sort of evolved as more contributions were made, but how do you sort of even think about a project of this scope? I mean, you write sort of very explicitly at the beginning that, of course, Black food is not monolithic, but it also is integral to the story of American cuisine. And so you're sort of working to tell stories that maybe are overdue or haven't been given as much credit historically. We know that. But you're also trying to represent something that is so wide-reaching and has so many facets to it. Was that a challenge as this book sort of came together over time?
I mean, it's always a challenge, especially when you admire something and you know the intent is to broaden the conversation, yet you can make mistakes. And I mean, our intent is to tell and shine light on these incredible chefs, past, present, future, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was The Rise is the type of book I wish if I was in culinary school, that I had, or something like that, right? And I think music has done it so well in terms of, if you think about American music and you think about Black contribution to American music, it's almost one, from gospel to jazz to R&B to funk to hip hop to rock and roll. In each of those segments, you can say, what era even, right? What era of funk? What era of hip hop? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And in food, we just don't have that layered yet, right? And, there is 5 original cuisines in America that all are linked and really passes. The majority of its origin come from the Black experience. When you think about Low Country, think about Cajun, Creole, Southern, that we refer to as very often as soul food, and barbecue. All of these are 5 original cuisines that all are part of the Black experience. Not only Black experience, but they're for everyone. But there's a big contribution there, right? That should be acknowledged. There should be clarity around the authorship. If you don't have clarity around authorship, you can't create great memories. Memories get muddled, and therefore the aspirations gets confused, right? And that muddiness doesn't start necessarily with America's history. It starts with, very often, greatness from Africa when it comes to food and raw product is taken out of Africa and credited to Europe, right? Cocoa beans from Ghana becomes chocolate, becomes Belgian chocolate, right? Sure. Ethiopian, Kenyan coffee becomes French roast coffee, and so on, right?
Right.
So if we don't understand where it comes from, it's very hard for us to understand and give credit where credit is due. So that was a very, very, very important part of the book. The other part is also, obviously, Black people have contributed as laborers forever anonymously in this country, as enslaved, and doesn't get credited enough. I mean, not just in food history, in any history, right? So, when I think about this book, and whether you think about the work that Nicole Hannah-Jones is doing, or whether there's the work that Isabel Wilkinson's doing, like caste, class, race, food, needs, should be talked about. And we have an opportunity to sit around the dinner table, unlearn the wrong side of history, relearn the history the way in a different manner, and then engage with it and give that credit, and broadcast that.
Osai also talked about bringing representation from across the food industry for this project.
How intentional was it to have the mix of types of folks that you have in terms of careers in the book, right? You mentioned some names already, but certainly this could have been a book of Black chefs. It's not exclusively Black chefs. There's activists, there's authors, there's all sorts of folks who work across the culinary spectrum. Was that determined at the outset, and how important was that to sort of have a wide sort of range of voices?
Yeah, that was definitely something that I was asked to bring to the project in terms of people who I thought would be kind of representative and indicative. The idea of food has come to me, food as a means to, restaurants and dining and things like that, that's evolved over time. But if you're thinking about the historic legacy of Black foodways, it has always required and involved people coming from different touch points, right? So to me, it would have been an incomplete story to only include folks who are doing that creative and very important chef work. But part of what creates the space for chefs to do what they do, at least in a more visible way, is the work that writers do, right? And the writers are oftentimes, learning from and being challenged by the activists, right? So, and it's a cyclical thing. We have sure. Matthew Rayford and Jovan Sage, who are one example of people who are working the lands, right? And also, he's a chef as well, Matthew, right? And Jovan is, they're out in New Brunswick, Georgia. She's looking at the plant medicine and the healing that is so deeply rooted in so many African diaspora cultures, and one that many people, specifically Black women, are finding their way back to more visibly, I would say, in the last decade or so. These are all integral. These are not necessarily things that get captured on the cover of magazines or get centered as people to watch on cable network, but this is where the work is happening. And so, yeah, these names that I put forward, many of them are people who I know. I've been at Gilliard Farm. I've been to Gilliard Farms in New Brunswick, Georgia. I've seen Matthew and Jovan's hens and hibiscus and, the old, tree. These are, it felt very natural, for me to call forth these relationships and, to ask them if they would share a bit of themselves with this project, which they all very generously did.
We'll be right back with the second part of our conversation with Marcus Samuelsson and Osai Endelin about their new book, The Rise. But first, let's go to Salt and Spine kitchen correspondent Sarah Varney, who's cooking from The Rise this week. Sarah joins us from New York, where she's making crab curry with yams and mustard greens.
One summer in college, I worked as a camp counselor on the eastern shore of Maryland. We sailed and slept for a week at a time on wooden sailboats called skipjacks. In the early morning hours, we'd set a line for crabs. As the sun rose, we'd run the line. The kids would stand by with their nets, but their excitement often spooked the crabs, which would drop off the line. But we'd steam the ones we managed to catch and spill them onto the deck for a feast. That was the memory that came into my mind when I read Marcus Samuelsson's recipe for crab curry with yams and mustard greens. But when I wanted to make the recipe here in Albany, New York, far from the Atlantic, the place to find fresh crab is the Asian supermarket on Central Avenue. Hello. Sitting below the fish counter next to the live frogs is a bucket of crabs, dozens crawling on top of each other, their blue-tipped claws flailing in the air. My partner, Jesse McKinley, steps up to the counter.
Can we get 3 pounds of crab? 3 pounds of crab?
The fishmonger uses metal tongs to pull the crabs out of the bucket. But as he picks them up, they hold tight to each other, forming long tendrils.
Where did these crabs come from?
Yeah.
Do you know which country? Where they came from?
From here.
From here, okay.
Yeah. Who's a good one? Oh, no, both of them, both.
That's right. Hang on to each other.
Thank you.
The crabs are small compared to the big ones we pulled out of the Chesapeake. Another customer digs through the bucket, and he seems disappointed by his options.
Which one are you trying to get? Bigger ones?
Yeah, I try to find bigger one, but too small that. Yeah, all small.
Do you know where they're from, the crabs?
I don't know. Maybe Connecticut? Maybe.
Yeah.
We find everything else we need for the recipe here, too. Sweet potatoes, garlic, ginger, red onion, even the curry leaves and the mustard greens.
Those are curry leaves. And in Chinese, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Kinjioi?
This is great. We're making a recipe that's from the American South, and we're shopping at an Asian supermarket.
That's why America's great.
It's great. I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should do these. These are habaneros.
Okay, great.
So you could do the orange. That's kind of pretty.
Those are beautiful.
All right, and now we want mustard greens. That's cabbage, water spinach, bok choy. These are yam leaves. Wow, look at those. Oh, here we go. Big mustard.
Pig mustard.
Perfect. Let's get 2 of those.
That was my name in college, by the way. Big mustard.
Get 2 of them.
Don't ask. Oh.
Back at the house, we put 2 pots of salted water on the stove to steam the crabs, and Jesse's 16-year-old son, Jake, joins us in the kitchen. Jesse reaches inside the paper bag of live, crawling, pinching crabs and starts picking them up one by one with his hand.
This is boiling.
So, what do we do?
So you can put some crabs in there.
Here it goes. It's kind of dangerous.
No, use the tongs. Jesse, that is a terrible idea. They're all hanging on to each other. All right, here goes more.
Is there a lid for these guys?
They really all hang on to each other, don't they?
All right.
Let's look ahead so we don't have to think about the death that's happening.
With the crabs steaming, we get to work, prepping the vegetables for the curry. Jake starts peeling and chopping the sweet potatoes into cubes, and Jesse starts in on the onion.
And it says julienne, but I don't actually know how to julienne something. Let's look.
Internet, tell us.
No. Okay, so julienne is, it's cut into long, thin strips similar to matchsticks. I mean, just try your best. This is not Julia Childs.
When we check on the crabs, a green grime is erupting from them. Their shells have turned a reddish orange, and we drain the crabs into a giant colander.
Yeah, okay. Grab the other one. I think they're so much smaller now.
We heat up 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil. The recipe says to add the onion, garlic, ginger, and turmeric when the oil starts to shimmer.
Is the oil shimmering?
It's starting to kind of glisten. I don't know if
Whoa.
it's shimmering.
It's crackling.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay,
It's
let's
shimmering.
put in the onion.
Yep. Done.
Okay, and the garlic and the ginger.
There we go.
Yeah.
We add in 2 teaspoons of turmeric and give it a stir.
It smells really good. Okay, now we need the cumin and the cayenne and the curry leaves. Maybe that's not curry.
Say curly?
Well, no, remember it was in Chinese. I don't know.
And that's when we put hemlock in the food.
We're not sure if the leaves we bought at the Asian supermarket are curry leaves, but we add them to the pot anyway. Then a teaspoon of cumin, a 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne, some tomato paste, and a chopped orange habanero pepper. And then we stir the yumminess for a few minutes.
Ooh, the smells are amazing. It's this nice orange color now, right?
Yeah, it's like curry.
Okay, so now it says add the coconut milk, the water, and then you can toss in the sweet potatoes. Whoa, kerplunk.
While the yam curry simmers, we check on the crabs. They've cooled enough out in the evening air to start picking out the meat.
Oh, wow.
Cleaning the crab is tedious work. The crabs are small, and there isn't a lot of meat on each one.
I sense there's some disappointment over here in the crab picking part of the kitchen.
I gotta say, it's a lot of work. I'm
It
not
is a lot of
gonna
work.
lie.
Our 3 pounds of live crab yields about a ramekin of crab meat.
All right, you got one more crab left. One lonely crab.
Oh, my God. I have newfound respect for people that make crab dishes. This is a lot of work. No kidding.
We add the chopped mustard greens to the simmering curried sweet potatoes, and the whole dish turns green and yellow. Then Jesse is ready to add his cup of hard-earned crab meat. Pour that in.
Okay. Bums away! Crabs away! All right.
Okay, and then it says add the crab and cook until heated through and the greens are wilted. 2 to 3 minutes more. Right, the greens are definitely wilted. It's funny, it has almost like a smoky smell to it. Here, come smell. Or is that just something that burned?
I think that's a smoky. Let's go with smoky.
Let's go with smoky. Okay, I'm going to turn it off.
It's just...
Okay, let's serve this up. We put a scoop of rice in each bowl and top it with the crab curry. We can't find the cilantro, but we do add lime wedges, which turn out to be delicious. When we sit down to eat, we fire up Outstanding by the Gap Band, a song suggested by the cookbook author.
Bon appetit, everybody.
Bon appetit. Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of your help.
That is tasty and spicy.
Yeah. What are the flavors that you're tasting?
Well, there's sweetness from the yams, and then there's a real kick from the habanero. I also just got a little bit of shell.
I blame the crab pickers.
That's my fault. My bad.
The yam and crab curry feels like a perfect spring dish when the nights are still cold and you want something warm and fragrant.
That's Salt and Spine kitchen correspondent Sarah Varney cooking from The Rise by Marcus Samuelsson and Osai Endelin. Each week, we love sitting down with another of your and my favorite cookbook authors on Salt and Spine to tell the stories behind cookbooks. From Jacques Pepin and Nigella Lawson to Samin Nosrat and Carla Hall to today's guests, Marcus Samuelsson and Osai Endelin, Salt and Spine is the leading podcast featuring interviews with your favorite authors. Plus, we publish delicious and exclusive recipes, hold cookbook giveaways for listeners like you, and so much more. We also just launched our new Salt and Spine Cookbook Club, where you can cook along with one of our featured authors every month, and then join us for a virtual dinner party with that author. Salt and Spine truly brings cookbooks to life, and we can only do it thanks to listeners like you. You can join the Salt and Spine community and support our effort to bring you top-notch interviews and the best cookbook content starting at just $2 a month. Find out more and join the Salt and Spine community today at patreon.com/saltandspine. And now back to our conversation with Marcus Samuelsson and Osai Endelin, authors of The Rise.
Yeah, I think sometimes folks feel like it can be sort of cliche to say that food is a great unifier and that food can bring folks together. But it is sort of, in some extent, an argument that you make to some extent in this book, because, I mean, you note that food history is history in a sense, and that food has always been, for instance, a core part of the movement for racial justice, and you write about that in the introduction to the book. Do you feel that food is sort of has this ability to play a role in bringing people together and building community and addressing some of the political and social issues that we face?
I will answer that with saying that, one of the biggest privileges is to be able to tell my story, a Black story, that is highly layered and complex. Mm-hmm. So even if you think about, I am an Ethiopian that grew up in Sweden, living in Harlem, there's many turns and complexity there. If you compare that to Naisha's story, that is Korean-American grandmother with African-American side, can you be both African-American, a chef from Los Angeles, and Korean-American? Of course you can, right?
Right.
There lies the complexity and the opportunity and the challenges and the deliciousness, right? Uh-huh. And almost only in America does that happen. And my point about the book was we talked about the 5 original cuisines, but then also obviously immigration, and then how people migrate and marry, and couples and travel changes too, right? So Blackness is vast. It's not just one thing. And then if you're going to start to teach from that point of view, you can't cover everything. So these singular stories were very important, that, that Nina Compton tells her story, that Greg tells his story, that, each one, and that's what Osei has done so wonderfully here. Like, here's an introduction, and maybe in your community, wherever you are, oh, I've never thought about that, chef. Oh, I never thought about that. That is not just one thing. So I think it's important to show our layer, our complexity, and our beauty. You know, Chef Jerome is Jamaican and Filipino, for example, in DC. Like there's all these issues that we all as Black people know that we're not just one thing. And this is an opportunity to really describe that. And that's what inspired me in terms of the recipe. That's what inspired us in terms of sharing these stories. And in the very end in the book, we give the Instagram handle to about 200 other chefs that we couldn't cover in the book, but just to show that this is not something that happening in New York or LA or Chicago only. There are incredible Black chefs throughout the country. If you have a company, if you're a private person, whatever you are, support it. We're here, you know? So yeah, it is complex to have a broad book and tell a broad story, but I felt like it was time, you know?
Yeah.
I think that was the most important thing. I'm not going to not do it because it couldn't be perfect, you know?
I talked with Osai about the same topic.
In the intro, there's a phrase, which I think is maybe important just to bring out for a moment, which ties into a lot of this. Food has always been part of the movement for racial justice. This book, I know, has been a long time in the making, and this book, I think, is a book that we should have welcomed at any time period, but it's being published now in this period where we are seeing a lot of national attention broadly on the conversations around racial justice. We are dealing with, as it's noted in the book, because this is such a new and timely book, the implications of COVID, the coronavirus, and the disproportionate impact that pandemic is having on Black people and people of color across the country. How do you sort of see this book fitting into where we are today in terms of the conversations around the contributions that Black people have made to American food and the way that we cook and eat today?
Well, I hope it's an invitation to further more interest. I mean, look, this is a dense book. There are a lot of recipes. There are a lot of stories. There were times even when I was working on this project, I needed to set the thing down because the sense of gravitas was just so high. But yes, I mean, if you understand that African people from just an incredibly diverse part of the world, were brought together and systemically pursued for a specific expertise and then forced to do many other, to perform many other roles in the making of societies throughout the Americas. All of that was rooted in agriculture, what we understand today to be agriculture. So all of the advocacy that we talk about today, stems from this core decision, right? So, from cultivating and growing the food to harvesting it, to butchering it, to distilling and fermenting and brewing, to preparing, to the service of it, to the presentation of it. I mean, all of that was led by African people or their descendants in this geographical area. And so, yes, when you understand that, Fannie Lou Hamer was advocating for voting rights, but she was also in Mississippi, in the Delta, working to create an opportunity for people to do something other than work plantations for little to no money. In the 60s, mind you, right? So this is not as old a history as many people from many backgrounds, including Black, would like to sometimes present it as being. And, we see the roots and, really the tentacles of that history pervade everything that we're experiencing today. You mentioned COVID, and so much of what we're experiencing in terms of the apathy toward restaurants is because so many of the people who work in restaurants are Black and brown people. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. So, of course, government doesn't care, because government has illustrated many, many times over and over again that when Black and brown people are at the center of the conversation, they don't want to have the conversation. And so I think this is a critical moment. I don't know that, in publishing, I'm starting to learn that things happen when they happen, right? You have deadlines and you have intentions. And I've seen people put themselves in the hospital to turn a book on time, only to have the publisher delay it by a year. So like, I don't know. Yeah. But like, right. I mean, this book was due earlier than it was turned in, and there are a lot of inside baseball reasons for that. But, the thing that you're holding in your hands is what came, and I would argue that this book would have been an important part of the conversation at any point in time, but it seems that it's struck a particular chord right now because more people, including in our industry, are more, at least on the surface, invested in recognizing so many of the gaps. And part of why, we have a resource section in the back of this book is to further illustrate to you that this conversation that the Rise is having is not new. And that if you've been missing it, it's not because it wasn't happening. Right. And so, where can you as a reader be engaged and accountable for your own biases and blind spots? And, it doesn't have to be a harsh conversation with yourself, but you should have a conversation with yourself, right? I mean, I even think about this, back in the day when we were traveling, if right. I was getting ready to go somewhere, and I would recognize, okay, there's an experience I want to have in this country I've never been to before, and there's a place where I'm at right now. How can I shore up that gap? Well, I'm buying books. I'm watching movies. I'm renting documentaries. I'm signing up for newsletters. I'm seeking out people from that country on Twitter, right? Like all of a sudden, within like 30 minutes, I can have like a graduate degree level of information like in my lap. Sure. Just from the effort of saying, I'm interested. Yeah. I will never forget last year. I will never forget this. I was having a much needed spa day. I was in Amman, Jordan, and I had been like going really hard for a really long time. I was like, I'm going to go and get myself worked out. And so one of the last services I had was a pedicure. And this woman who, she was very chatty. She, we were talking a lot. She was from the Philippines, and she was speaking English to me. She was speaking Tagalog to her colleague. She was speaking Arabic to the proprietor of the spa. And she just let me know that she also spoke Spanish, which, is not surprising because she's from the Philippines. But, we're just making conversation, and I have French pretty good, right? Like that's my, that's my check mark. So I said, how is it that you, you learned all these languages? And as she's buffing my nails, she goes, if you care about it, you learn it. Yeah. And I was like, next question. Yeah, like it's true. Anything that you've learned, you had to give a shit about it for like a minute. And so you cannot say that you are interested in American cooking, American cuisine, if you're not including Black foodways in that conversation. And if every name in this book is new to you, I would argue that that's like a call to action. And it could be a really exciting and emotional one, but it's one that I implore people to take.
I took the opportunity of talking with Chef Marcus Samuelsson to also talk more broadly about the cookbook industry.
Yeah, and as we talk about the stories of Black cooks being under-acknowledged or unacknowledged, historically, we are a show on cookbooks, obviously, and we look at the cookbook industry, and that's clearly reflected there in terms of who's getting cookbook deals, who's able to tell their own stories, who's able to author things. I think we're sort of seeing shifts. Of course, now we have books like this. We have Tony Tipton Martin's works, which have been hugely successful, and others we could name. Where do you sort of see the cookbook publishing food media industry moving, either in the past few years, or what are we on the cusp of in terms of representing Black voices more holistically?
The cookbook industry has a lot of catching up to do, right? Yeah. Publishing in general has a lot of catching up to do. So I think that, I'm super excited about the next wave of incredible Black chefs coming out with books next year, whether it's Eduardo is coming up with his book, Mashama is coming out with her book, Adrian is coming out with her book. You know what I mean? So there's a whole wave. I think Nicole's book's coming out next year as well. I just know the amount of books that people have just told me that's coming out, right? And I think it's due to several different things. Through social media, people can publish in a completely different way. So there's less gatekeepers and different gatekeepers, which means that more stories going to get told and shared. That's fantastic. That's incredible. And I'm not worried about the future. You can't really undo the past, but you can acknowledge it, right? And we have a very American history towards Blackness. It's obviously very, very, it's documented, it's complicated, it's never portrayed us in a fair way in terms of our contribution, what we've given. The publishing side reflects that, and I do think that it starts to acknowledge it, but whether it's acknowledged or not, people will publish and create an audience. And social media has been a major factor to that, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, I know The Rise, of course, is not an encyclopedic work, and you mentioned there's 200 chefs you couldn't include, and of course, many, many others who aren't even mentioned in the pages of the book. Say someone does pick up The Rise with an inclination of wanting to better sort of learn and understand the history of Black cooking in the United States and across the world. Is there a particular recipe or section or person you might say, like, start here? This is a good way to sort of acclimate yourself to this book and what it's trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that starting with Leah, I think it's amazing. It's Leah Chase.
Leah Chase, yeah.
But, at 96, she cooked all the way to the end. Yeah. And her restaurant Dooky Chase started in the 40s. And Leah's seen it all, from the Black vote, civil rights movement. It was illegal to serve Black and white people in a restaurant. She took a chance. She was both an advocate and an activist.
Yeah.
She was also in the Beyonce video. Pretty dope.
Yeah.
So,
right.
But there's also a couple of, and doing this work, I knew it, but it was even more in front of me. The amount of incredible depth we owe to Black women. And I'll just highlight some in the beginning, like Miss Georgina, that she was a mother of 6, single mother of 6, woke up 3 o'clock in the morning, baked pies, and raised about $100 a week in the 50s to the civil rights movement, right? So there's a movement and activism way before there were pop-ups, but it was a pop-up in a way, right? But way before it was like a way to communicate it, but only word of mouth, right? And then you think about someone like Sophia Wright that was in front of Lyndon B. Johnson with her food and had that important presence in front of him. So sometimes it doesn't always have to be, food is much bigger than restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's I love restaurants. I've devoted my life to restaurants. But food was there, and particularly what restaurants and food means to Black people is a very different journey than it means for white people, right?
Yeah.
They never had to think about whether they could sit somewhere, whether it was, all of those different things, right? And in the beginning of the book talks a little bit about that. And the final part of the book was done during and post Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the movement that is happening during the pandemic completely changed or emphasized how we were working on the book, as a collective.
I also talked with Osai about the future, both for the cookbook industry and the broader culinary world at large.
I love how the book is organized, too, in terms of the structure of the actual book, because I think it speaks to that point, too, that there's a chapter called Next, or a section called Next, rather, about what's next for Black cooking in America. I think there's often this terminology as we talk about the contributions that Black cooks make to American food, that it's something that has happened in the past, and it's sort of a two-pronged approach, right? I think it's really important for folks to understand that Black cooks' contributions to what American food is today have historically been undervalued or underrepresented or not credited in any way at all. But there's also this other component that I think is really important of celebrating the now and the next. And I think this book really does a great job of sort of balancing that. Can you talk about sort of what's on the horizon and what sort of you learned as you were putting this book together about how Black folks are innovating in the culinary spaces across the country?
Well, the innovation has been constant, right? We've never not innovated. And I think that's a good thing. You may feel like, oh, duh, I know that. But it was important for me to say that to myself and to, kind of express that to collaborators on this project. We need to be careful that we're not presenting this cuisine, or these cuisines, I should say, as we are inventing the wheel. We're not inventing anything here. We are documenting what has already existed and what continues to exist, whether or not this book ever sees the light of day. And I think that's an important sort of humble and political stance to take, because it recognizes like we're still learning, like we're still in the collection stage. This history was not just sort of arbitrarily lost. It was disappeared. Just like, you strip someone of their name and you put a number on their shirt and you tell them, you call them by that number, right? Like, you know what I'm talking about. This is, it's the same, is the same idea. The difference was that, the people who did this work from, the earliest years of this country had their seasonings, their flavors, their spices, their culinary expertise, their agricultural expertise. It just it kind of seeped into, the woodwork, so to speak, right? It kind of became a part of the fabric. And then one day you wanted to make a certain classification of work a professional classification, and now only white people can do it. And now it's a job, right? Now it demands wages. But that was always there. And that's why it's so important, particularly for people of color, to understand how different things are for people who identify as Black, because there was never the option, even if you did immigrate here as someone Black from an African nation like my father did, or people who came from the Caribbean, which is a whole world of history in all of those, countries and islands, you still got kind of sidelined into this narrative, whether or not it was yours, your sort of heritage. But what differs from other POC whose family, who they themselves may have immigrated here, is that there was potentially a choice. And I'm not saying that the choice was always like super easy, right? There are people from Indian, Thai, Malaysian, Chinese backgrounds who are still kind of fighting to get the recognition they deserve, or to be able to charge what they want to charge. I mean, there's certainly tons of ignorance out there to go around. But I'm saying that it's different because for many other cultures, there was a decision at some point to say, I'm going to adapt my cuisine in order so I can have a clientele in the middle of Iowa and sell lo mein and cheeseburgers, right? Like that history has been very beautifully documented in many places. I'm not saying that was simple, or that was not without its tensions, but it still was different than sort of being kind of baked in to this idea that, Black people belong in this particular social space and, they can never move out of it. So even to just acknowledge that, yes, like, there is food that's distinct from Jamaica, which is distinct from St. Lucia, which is distinct from what's going on in Texas, which is distinct from what's going on, in North Charleston, which is distinct from what's happening in Baltimore, which is distinct from perhaps, what you see represented in Harlem. And that it really is up to no one to try to present themselves as an expert on every single one of these stories, right? And it would be foolish to try. And I think that we tried to organize this book in a way that, in many ways, you could switch people out from different chapters just depending on what part of their lives you want to focus on, right?
Sure.
So I urge folks to not be too prescriptive. Mashama Bailey, I think, we have her in the migration conversation, but she could easily be in the next conversation, right? That's just one example. Everyone, chapter 4 is legacy, but like everyone here is talking about a legacy in some way. So to make a book readable, to make a cookbook actionable, you have to break it up. You have to have an index. You got to like be able to point people. But I hope when folks start, and what I've been learning from readers who have gotten in touch with me is that they sit down and they just read the thing, right? Yeah. They're like, let me read the openers. Let me read these profiles. And then they like sit with it. And then they're able to cook. I have not encountered anyone who's reached out to me directly who just started making food. They wanted to sit with these people and their stories first. And that is gratifying to me because, a book is not going to time out. You can open it anytime. And, I hope more than just, and honestly, I hope that people who get the Rise, you're inspired to say, wow, let me go look more into Adrian Miller's incredible oeuvre. Let me go buy The President's Kitchen Cabinet. Let me go get his book, Soul Food. Let me go get Tony Tipton Martin's Jubilee. Let me recognize that people like Shakira Simley are like in our midst, right? Like she's not a quote unquote, food personality, right? I don't think she would describe herself that way. She's working, City Hall in San Francisco, right? To fight for racial equity. But that's a person who's deeply rooted, her work around race extends from her experiences around food and the inequity she saw, growing up in Harlem and coming to California and recognizing access and opportunity that was denied her and her family, specifically, her grandmother. So I feel like if you look, you will see, as you mentioned earlier, this notion that, of course, food is always political and that you cannot ever extract food from the conversation around equity and justice, particularly as it pertains to Black people.
As one of the most visible chef restaurateurs in the country, I also wanted to talk to Marcus Samuelsson about the impact of COVID on the restaurant industry, something that he addresses in the early pages of The Rise.
Yeah, I mean, the book obviously years in the making, but the opening pages couldn't be more timely with what you just noted, and also with COVID. I mean, you acknowledge the impacts that COVID is having on the restaurant industry, the disproportionate impacts, the disproportionate way that COVID has impacted communities of color. How has the pandemic sort of affected, has it affected how you think about food and feeding people in the service industry? I know giving back has always been a core component of what you do, but I know you've converted Red Rooster into serving meals for first responders and frontline workers. And you talk in Yes Chef, I remember when I read Yes Chef about having to lay people off after 9/11 and how hard that was and how challenging that was. And it feels like we're in another sort of moment that's just really brought to the forefront some of the challenges that we're facing and will face as a restaurant industry. How has that sort of impacted how you're thinking and operating?
Everything, right?
Yeah.
Like March 15, we had to take that decision to close Red Rooster in Harlem and convert it to a community kitchen together with Jose Andres and World Central Kitchen. Mm-hmm. We went on a different unknown chapter. From March 15 to October 15, we served 220,000 meals.
Wow.
We had no restaurant anymore the way we thought about Red Rooster. Yet, we knew that we were working on probably the most important part of Red Rooster.
Yeah.
Our regulars changed. And that profoundly changes you. At the same time in Miami, we opened, we closed, we opened, we closed, and we just now finally opened again. And I mean, serving is part of being in hospitality. And I think about that in all my work. I think about it as a Black chef, think about the privileges I have as a Black male chef. I wouldn't be here without the civil rights movement, for example, right? So I stand on those shoulders. So I always think about how do you pay back and how do you be hospitable, whatever the situation is, whether it's my work through CCAP, Harlem Meetup, where we have our own fund, where we emphasize on Black businesses and restaurant businesses. Even out of the Rise, we raised a lot of money. We have a Black fund that's going to go to Black and brown restaurant businesses. And so this is part of the work. Mm-hmm. This is not something we're going to be out of in 9 months when everyone got the vaccine. First of all, I don't believe everyone will get the vaccine. Who's going to get it? And
right.
You can figure out yourself who's going to get it first and who will get it last, right? It's all connected to finance and access and all of those different things, right? And how that impact Black and brown communities. But I'm so impressed with how Harlem and the restaurant community here have responded. But I'm always optimistic, and this is the first time I'm not super optimistic because this will be with us for a very, very long time. These PPP loans are not just going to make everything good again. There are fundamentally huge changes that has happened already. Consumer behavior has changed, and we're not going back to November 2019.
Right.
And as Black and brown businesses have harder to get access to finance and different generational wealth and access to cash, this will have impact on us. Yeah. But we've always been entrepreneurial, so there's also stories of hope. Maybe this is the time where you start that home business online. If you are amazing at cookies or if you're amazing at catering so there's always another side of that it might not be in four walls restaurant. It might look something else, And I do know that we're resilient and we'll work hard. And I do know I will work as hard as I can to provide for as many as I can.
I always relish the chance to talk with Osai because she always has great insight onto what we can expect for the cookbook industry and really the food media at large. So I took the opportunity to close our conversation by asking for some insight into where the industry is headed and what she's watching at the moment.
You mentioned a few names just now: Tony Tipton Martin, Adrian Miller, Adrian Miller has a forthcoming cookbook. I know he's written other books, but has a barbecue book coming soon. Yeah, which I'm really excited about. There's a number of cookbook authors and folks who have forthcoming cookbooks who are in the pages of The Rise. And I'm just wondering about your perspective on, this is something we've talked about a lot on our show, but Black cooks, Black authors being underrepresented in the cookbook industry and food media industries specifically. And I think we're at a moment where there's sort of an increased attention being paid by cookbook publishing houses to Black voices, and we're seeing more deals for Black authors. But do you have any thoughts on sort of what the trajectory looks like for Black authors in cookbook world, in food publishing worlds, or another way to put that question too might be if there are specific folks we should be paying attention to for folks who want to learn more, like some of the names you've mentioned.
Yeah, well, I have to be careful because I know sometimes I'm aware of projects, but they may not have been officially announced.
Sure.
And I don't want to preempt, anyone. But
that's fair.
Yes, I mean, I think what we will see, of course, folks may know listening to your show that it usually takes a couple of years to turn a project around, and sometimes it can take longer. Which is to say that the books that you're going to see in 2022 are, getting turned in right now, right? Like they're getting photographed, maybe even as early as 2021 in some cases. So people are working very hard to fulfill this need and, this desire to see more. I use the term African diaspora to, encapsulate a lot of different folks and stories, but I think you'll see more of a narrowing, back to that point I made about the personal being that access to the universal. I think we'll start to understand more of, the regional histories of many cuisines and many people's stories. I think you're going to see more embrace of people who describe themselves as immigrants and kind of merging their homeland with, what they've come to make as home here. And I also think that, hopefully we'll continue to see a certain, I appreciate scholarship. I appreciate, study, and thoughtfulness, but at the same time, there's room for levity. There's room for exploration and experimentation. And sometimes what happens when you have something that you're holding so dear and so precious because it has been so poorly treated or so abused is that you're reticent to see it kind of like riffed on, right? Like, if people are kind of familiar with conversations in jazz music, right? It's like you play the melody and then you improvise, right? Like you don't start off just playing whatever the heck you want because you're trying to, but part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to level with the listener, right? You're trying to say, here's where I am, but here's where I'm going, or here's where I'm going to take you, or like, and there's a reason why that happens with a thing called standards, right? These things that everybody knows, these songs that everybody's familiar with. You're like, oh, that's the A Train. That there was a riff on that, right? Like you recognize it. We have not seen these dishes. I'm speaking very generally, but I would argue that we have not seen these dishes attributed correctly long enough to be playful without context. So, I think that you'll see that continued struggle. And sometimes that's a generational conversation. Sometimes, it's an identity conversation. And, it keeps people up at night, right? I mean, I have a friend working on a comprehensive book about a very large region, and he's stressed, right? Like he's from that region, but he's like, oh my God, like, how do I, and so he's interviewing all kinds of people. He's buying all kinds of old books. He's, before he was traveling, right? And my heart goes out to him because I know he's doing his best. And ultimately, what you need is a plurality of these conversations, right? You need 50 rises, right? Yeah. Like you need everyone in this book to have had an opportunity to say what they want to say with a real budget and a real marketing team and a real shot at getting this narrative out there. And I think that the future is as diverse as we are willing to accept it as being. And, that means that readers, like, if you can afford to pre-order these books, you got to pre-order them, right? If you see someone you're interested in, you got to follow them on Instagram, sign up for their newsletter. It's a reciprocal act. It's not just one way. And, when these events happen, through your library or through your local bookstores, and please support your local bookstores, you got to attend. And if you're not in a position to spend the money, then, perhaps, you can amplify or share information in other ways. But it's encouraging more that creates more, right? We live in a capitalist society, ultimately, that's the gig. So I hope I think that's where we're going. I think there's more, and I think there are more voices on the way. And I'm certainly thankful to, be working with some of them. I hope, you'll see in coming years, but it's a long road, but I think, it's a tasty one. And it's also one where, we're just going to continue to be peeling back the layers and learning and unlearning. And hopefully we can do it together. I think it's more fun that way, usually.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Osai. This was so great to have you. And thanks for joining us to talk today.
Thank you for having me back.
And I closed my conversation with Marcus by also taking a forward look and asking what advice he has for young folks hoping to make a name in the industry.
We're a show on cookbooks. Obviously, you've written a number of them, and including done some innovative things. Like, I really loved the work you did with Audible on like the digital cookbook, I guess we could call it, sort of a hybrid of like a podcast and a cookbook, diving into Harlem and African-American culinary history, really sort of exploring the medium there. We always like to ask authors, especially folks like you who have written a number of books, if there are other cookbook authors who have been particularly influential to you as you've become a cookbook author yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say for me, this is maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I sat with Jessica Harris and Miss Leah Chase in New Orleans with Eric Lola's Eli as well, amazing writer, and just in awe of Miss Jessica's work, but also Leah's work, and how storytelling, writing, I think Jessica worked as an assistant to James Baldwin back in the days, and they were sharing food stories, but they were sharing writing stories as well. And sure. At that point, I just finished my Aquavit cookbook, where it's a very good book. It's a great cookbook, but I wasn't at the point where I could share stories the way they talked about stories and shared stories. I wasn't there yet. And that was your
first book, right?
Yeah. And I was just thinking about it, like, wow, one day I want to be as fluent in storytelling, and because there was so much depth in their stories. And I was so lucky being on that dinner with them. And so that had huge impact on me. Charlie Trotter's first cookbook. Yeah. I'd never seen food. And Charlie was one of my first mentors here in America. When the late Patrick Clark died, Charlie Trotter organized a cookbook that a lot of chefs had to help out and print. So that had huge impact on me, because I remember getting the faxes from Charlie Trotter's like, recipe test these 15 dishes. And I was just, yes, chef, and you did it, right?
Right.
But Charlie Chef Trotter I learned a lot from him, but these books I've never seen food being shot like that. I never seen the complexity of the food being dealt with in that way. And it was an American chef, which made it more rock and roll to me. Something that, I had great French cookbooks, of course, but it was still something that they do. Once I saw it from Chef Trotter, it was like, whoa, this is something I can relate to. There's many books that has been game changing for me, but I would if I would just talk about two chefs and stories and people, I would talk about those two.
Yeah. What advice do you give to young people who have a cookbook in their professional sites, particularly perhaps young people of color who might want to move into the culinary world, the restaurant industry, write a cookbook? Nothing beats do it. Yeah.
And document your journey. The beauty about young people now, you have so many different mediums. Record yourself. Start your own podcast with your buddy. document your journey, tell your truth, tell your story, and you will also see your own growth. I think it's an amazing time to be part of the American food scene. As challenging as it is right now for us in the restaurant industry, it's still a dynamic time in the food landscape, and it's broader and more diverse than ever. I want to talk about one thing that, as Black people, we entered food in a different way because we worked so much in the anonymous space based on just being Black and how upside down the country saw us.
Right.
So the fact that we haven't been able to vote until the mid-60s, and haven't really had access to capital to maybe like 20 years ago. So you can't just say, so it's harder for us to start our own publishing company, or do you know what I mean? Or very often amazing chefs when I came in the 90s were Black chefs, and then somewhere in the 30s, they have to change to become servers to make more money because they only became sous chefs. And there was always a Swiss or a French or another chef flown in to become the head chef. So we lost a whole generation of incredible chefs that never got the title, therefore never, that changes aspirations, desires, but also us as a profession, as a trajectory. So there's many reasons why, and they're all linked back to class, race, culture, and finance in many different ways. But I do think these are different times somewhat, and I'm really inspired by this next wave. And for me, it was important in the Rise also that we showed many different people. One of the most important person in the book is someone like Marvin Woods and Donna Pierce. Marvin has done everything in the industry, from cater, from working on the ship, from owning his own restaurant, from working with a big corporate company. He really shows you what a career can look like. There's nothing in food that Marvin haven't seen. And I've learned a ton from Marvin. Donna Pierce, food editor at the Chicago Tribune, but a food scholar. That was just a smaller part of what her day job was, but she had an enormous amount of wealth of knowledge in terms of food. So there's these incredible gems of knowledge out there that some are very known and some are not. But it was important that we told vast varieties of stories of who we are.
Yeah. I know you have said before you often live by the phrase, each one teach one. Mm-hmm. You are one of the most visible, most well-known Black chefs in the country. Do you think about your personal legacy often and what impact you're leaving on the culinary world?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in terms of I'm here because I had mentors that helped me and saw something in me that I didn't see. I understand, when I was a young kid. But it was my mentors who were like, no, we should push you, Marcus, right? So if you've been raised like that with great, amazing mentors, Leah helped me from the 90s. She's like, you need to go higher. You can do it. Patrick Clark, Charlie Trotter. So, of course, when you have been led by excellent mentors like that, all the work at Red Rooster, the why we opened Red Rooster, the work of CCAP, the work of the books is to inspire and aspire, like those intersections. Absolutely. And I think it's even more particular when you are a Black chef, because you want to see a shift in terms of not just people working in the industry, but also senior management and ownership. And that shift is now starting to happen. Yeah. So I think that as difficult it is in the restaurant industry today, some of the most important work is being done right now. The fact that both you and me, we know maybe 15 incredible, 20 incredible Black chefs and culinarians. And then you add photographers to that, and then you add writers to that, and then you add stylists and so on to that. So, what I mean? Like it is a shift, now Don Davis is the head of Bon Appetit,
Right.
Number 2 is Sonia Chopra. Like those are massive shifts of industry. That stuff just doesn't happen. It takes work to create those shifts.
Yeah, and sometimes turmoil.
Yes.
Yeah, often turmoil. Yeah,
often turmoil. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, but so now there is shift in personnel, and now you can have another dialogue and so on. Right? I don't see any change in anything that has happened easy.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Marcus. This was so great to talk to you, and congratulations on your latest book.
Thank you very much for having me, and keep doing the great work.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so thrilled to talk with both Marcus Samuelsson and Osai Endelin in this episode. As always, you can find bonus content from today's show and all of our episodes on our website, saltandspine.com. There you'll find 2 featured recipes from The Rise that you can make at home. Remember, if you like hearing from your favorite authors on Salt and Spine, and I hope you do, please click subscribe wherever you're listening. You can also leave us a rating on iTunes, and you can join the Salt and Spine community and support our show at patreon.com. Our show today was produced by me, Brian Hogan Stewart. Our kitchen correspondent is Sarah Varney. The Salt and Spine original theme song was created by Brunch for Lunch. Salt and Spine is typically recorded at the Civic Kitchen in San Francisco's Mission District. The Civic Kitchen is now offering digital classes for home cooks. Find out more at civickitchensf.com. Thanks, as always, to Jen Nurse, Chris Bonomo, and the Civic Kitchen team, to Edible San Francisco, to Celia at Omnivore Books, and to Monique at Hardcover Cook. We'll be back next week with more stories behind the cookbooks you love.
Want the epic stuff, the extraordinary stuff, the edge of your seat stuff? You know, the good stuff. With AMC Plus, you can watch the best of AMC, BBC America, IFC, Sundance Now, Shudder, and more. Hungry for horror? Feast on Shudder's chilling originals like Creepshow Season 2 and killer premieres like Train to Busan Presents Peninsula. Got a need for speed? The boys are back with an epic tour of the UK as Top Gear races through a new season. All available on AMC Plus, ad-free and on demand. Start your free trial today at amcplus.com. AMC Plus, only the good stuff.